Thanks be to God. Well, good morning. Let us open with a word of thanksgiving. Good and gracious God, for the blessings of our life and the blessings of faith in Christ that gives us a community and a home, we are always grateful. May your Spirit give us a new life as we hear your word this morning. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so this morning we're going to do chapter 9 and 10 of the Gospel of John. And I think what let's do, let's kind of read through little portions of chapter 9 and then talk about it a little bit, okay? Because remember, chapter 9 is a continuation of the story we see Jesus at the festival of booths or shelter or tabernacle or whatever you want to call it, from chapter 7 through 9. So we're going to, that story is going to continue. And in fact, it's probably going to continue through 10. And then in the middle of 10, it's going to shift gears to a different festival, which we'll get to in just a moment. So this, I must tell you, is an incredibly important chapter in my own life. And I'll tell you why in a bit. But this chapter has helped me enormously in understanding stuff. But before we read this chapter, I want to turn to the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, and I want to read you what the 5th commandment says, and it is rather unsettling what it says. Come in, Mark. We're looking at John 9 and 10, but I wanted to read from the 10 Commandments the 5th. Let's say no, this is the 4th commandment. The 4th commandment: observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. You have 6 days in which to do your work, but the 7th day is a day of rest dedicated to me. On that day, no one is to work, neither you nor your children, nor your slaves, nor your animals, nor the foreigners who live in your country. In 6 days, I made the earth, the sky, the seas, and everything in it. On the 7th day, I rested. That is why I, the Lord, blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. Okay, so the 4th commandment is about the Sabbath, because chapter 9 is going to turn on the issue of Jesus breaking the Sabbath. Okay, now one other one, the 2nd commandment. This is what it says: do not make for yourselves images of anything in heaven and on earth or in the water under the earth. Do not bow down to any idol or worship it, because I am the Lord your God, and I tolerate no rivals. I bring punishment on those who hate me, and on their descendants down to the 3rd and 4th generation. But I show my love to thousands of generations of those who love me and obey my laws. Okay, so in the 10 Commandments, you have both the issue of Sabbath, which we'll get to in a moment, and this issue of God visiting the sins of the parents on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation, right? Now, in the Exodus, if you read the commentaries, when it says 3rd and 4th generation, it actually means, but I'm just going to limit it to 3 or 4 generations. And then after that, it's going to be fine. You know, so when people read this, they often think, oh, that's horrible, 3rd and 4th. No, just the 3rd and 4th generation is how you should read that. Okay. But in this gospel, there is an assumption that sins of the parents can be visited on children. And we'll see that in just a minute. Come on in. We hadn't even started reading chapter 9 of John. If y'all want a Bible, there's one behind you.
Yeah.
So what you guys missed was we were talking about in the 10 Commandments, there's the 4th commandment about the Sabbath. And then there's the 2nd commandment about no idolatry and God visiting the sins of the parents on the children for the 3rd and 4th generation, you know, that sort of thing. Okay, so both of those are going to play a hand in our reading. And here's what I would say. Remember this: the Gospels are planted in Jewish soil, they're transplanted into a Grecian urn, and they're placed in a Roman garden. And if one does not get the Jewish soil, you will usually not understand what you're reading in the Gospels. So here's the Jewish soil, the second and the fourth commandment. Okay? All right, here we go. This is Jesus still in Jerusalem, and he's still at the festival of tabernacles or shelter or booths, however you want to call it. And let's just read, I'll read the first 12 verses, okay? So this is John 9, 1 through 12. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been born blind. And his disciples asked him, "Teacher, whose sin caused him to be born blind? Was it his own or his parents' sin?" And Jesus answered, "His blindness has nothing to do with his sins or his parents' sins. He is blind so that God's power might be seen at work in him. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After he said this, Jesus spat on the ground and made some mud with the spittle. He rubbed the mud on the man's eyes. I wonder what he was thinking when that happened. And told him, "Go and wash your face in the pool of Siloam." This means sent. So the man went, washed his face, and came back seeing. His neighbors then, and the people who had seen him begging before him, asked, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" And some said, "He is the one." But others says, "No, it's not. He just looks like him." So the man himself said, "I am the man. How is it that you can now see?" they asked. And he answered, "The man called Jesus made some mud, rubbed it on my eyes, and told me to go to Siloam and wash my face. So I went, and as soon as I washed, I could see." "Well, where is he now?" they asked. And he answered, "I don't know." Okay. So many weird things in this passage, right? Okay. First of all, Siloam is a pool that's south of the temple. There's another one north of the temple called Bethesda, but this is south of the temple. And Jesus sees the man and spits on dirt, makes it mud, I guess, and puts it on his eyes. What's going on here? Have we missed the medicinal purposes and properties of dirt and mud and spit? George, did you learn that in medical school?
It was not in one of my books.
George has said he did not read that in medical school.
2,000 years later, you're not keeping up.
Yeah. Well, why not, George?
Well, they do mud facials.
Hey, mud facials, thank you. So put those little things on your eyes and yeah, but this time it was just on his eyes, right? So it's a very odd story. By the way, you get that in the other gospels too, that Jesus will spit on something. And so apparently in the first century mind, it had something to do with healing. Now, by the way, if you're out in the woods and you cut yourself, the people say, if you can't find anything else, put dirt on the cut, right, George? No. This is what my Boy Scout leader said. Anyway. Coffee grounds. Okay.
That's for bee sting.
Bee sting. Mud for a bee sting.
It works.
Bee sting for muds. Okay, remember that. All right. So Jesus finds this man in the temple. He's been begging because he has no way to support himself. And Jesus comes up to him and notice unannounced. It's not like the man asked Jesus. Jesus approaches him and puts this compact on his eyes, tells him to go to the pool of Siloam to wash himself. Is somebody out there?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you might. Oh, Nicole's being summoned. Okay. Goodbye, Nicole. And he goes to the pool and he washes off his face and he can see. Oh my. And then the rest of this chapter is so weird because you're going to have basically two sets of people that are going to be seeing this blind man who now can see. And they've all known him. Well, some say, well, he looked like him, but here's what's going to be. There are going to be some people who kind of say, well, yes, that's the guy, and I know he was blind, and now so they start verifying. And then you're going to have a different group, the religious leaders, who are going to test him. Matthew's sermon today is on testing. That will test him throughout the rest of the chapter. So here's what's weird. The rest of the chapter is about the blind man defending himself and Jesus as to what happened to him. And there'll be some folks out on the sideline who'll say, yeah, that was him. But others will say, no, you weren't the man, or we'll see in a moment, you really were born in sin, and who are you to tell us? So it's one of the most interesting miracle stories in the Gospels, in that you have a subject of Jesus' healing power starting then to defend himself. And then as the chapter goes on, not only does he defend himself, he starts defending Jesus. So it's like he's been put on the witness stand. Now he can see, but now what? He's on the witness stand. And you have some people kind of defending him. His parents are kind of willing to throw him under the bus. We'll see in a moment. But the religious leaders are accusing him of all kinds of things. And watch what they accuse him of. And then Jesus, he's going to start defending more and more. So if you put it this way, as chapter 9 goes along, this man born blind who now can see gets his sea legs, and he becomes ever more aggressive in his defense of himself and of Jesus. So it's really, John 9 is a trial scene. And who's being put on trial? In John 9, it's the followers of Jesus.
That's what the whole thing is about, is this divide between the different peoples as far as, the miracle happens. And then it's what happens to the people.
Exactly.
So
the point is, if I can say it for the umpteenth time, nothing is more controversial in the Gospels than miracles, because they do not authenticate themselves automatically. You have some people, that was the blind man, and then that's not possible. And watch how this now seeing man defends himself and then moves more toward defending Jesus. This is the church put under duress. And this is John 9 is written for a church that's under duress. And here's how you respond. I've often compared John 9 to Jesus' trial before Pilate. It's very similar in structure, actually, if you wanted to study it real carefully. Okay.
The heading on the last little bit is spiritual blindness.
Spiritual blindness. Okay, before we go into more of the chapter, let me tell you quickly why this chapter is so important to me. Okay. When I was 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, there was no issue more important to me theologically and philosophically than the issue of human suffering. It was sort of generated first by the Vietnam War, but I won't go into that. What it was really generated by is that when I finished college, I did 2 years of work in the state schools of Texas. And back then, in the 70s, the state schools were places where folks with disabilities of all kinds were more or less warehoused. I mean, it was glorified warehousing. And so we were terribly understaffed. And so I did a year at Abilene State School, and then a year at Austin State School, and then I began seminary after that. Okay. I go to Abilene State School, and I had never been around a lot of people with physical and mental disabilities. Now, I'd known some, but I'd never been in a setting where there's a room about 3 times the size of this room that was completely filled with folks with physical disabilities. And my job was to feed them, change their diapers, bathe them, and keep them from killing each other. And I did that for a year. And so one day and the dorm 22 that I was on, that worked on, these were profoundly disabled folks. They couldn't talk. They could scream. They couldn't talk. And so I was thrown into a situation where I and one other guy were responsible for 30 or so people. And what does that mean, responsible? Well, you'd kind of pick them up and set them on a bench, and then you would sort of feed them by hand, and then you'd change their diaper or bathe them, put them back on the bench, and then you do that for 8 hours. That was your job, you know. And it was a shock, you know. I'll just say it. It was an emotional and physical shock to me. Then I even got put on one dorm that I actually had to ask to not be on. Hydrocephalic babies. You know that word, George? So I worked on that dorm for 2 days. I said, no, folks, I'm sorry. Put me back to dorm 22, you know. So I went back to dorm 22. Anyway, so I went home one night and I read John 9. And I thought about the issue of birth. Is birth defects the right word to say these days, George? Is that okay? I don't know if that's politically correct. Anyway, I thought a lot about birth defects because 99.9% of the people I was taking care of, it was birth defects. They were born that way, as the man born blind, right? And I thought about birth defects. And here's the deal. The disciples are imagining that there's one of two causes of a birth defect. Did y'all get that?
Right.
What were the two causes?
Parents there.
All right. Now, so the sins of the parents visited on the children. Remember the Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments. Get that? So there was some tradition in Israel that if someone was born with a defect or something like that, you know, sins of the parents. And by the way, that can turn into kind of karma and reincarnation real quickly, but that's not what's going on here. It's not a reincarnation issue. It's rather God inflicts, you know, punishment on the second, to the third and fourth generation, but no more. Right? Okay. Or what's this other option?
Sins in the child.
What was this? A bad kid in the womb? Oh, what happened? You know, this is a very, very naughty boy in the womb.
Kicked a little too hard.
He kicked too hard, and so therefore, boom. You know.
Placenta a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah. It's not, but notice in either case, the issue is to do what? Is to find fault. Somebody's to blame for this. Somebody's born blind, or somebody's born with, in my case, profound physical and mental disabilities. I mean, the people I was caring for were so low the IQ chart, you couldn't test them, you know, and they couldn't do a thing for themselves physically. I mean, zero. And by the way, back in that era, a lot of parents would feel shame that they had produced that kind of child. And so what would they do? They would drive up to the front of the Abilene State School and say, here's my kid. And oh, by the way, no parents visited. I never, in a year, I never saw a parental visit. You know, the shame.
That was the chain them to the end of the bed era too, sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, just kept in a room and not come out.
You know, I don't want to go back there, but what I'm trying to say, y'all, is that think of me as a kind of lower middle class kid, you know, working parents, you know, I kind of go through life without too much trauma, you know, whatever, and then boom, dorm 22.
That's kind of interesting. I worked at Shriners Hospital, which is a different situation. I mean, they were birth defects and they had a hard time walking, all different kinds of stuff. But the mental thing was by and large not there. I mean, occasionally. And I found it to be real interesting when you put all these kids together.
Yeah.
They became regular kids. They'd be
Yeah.
whacking each other with crutches and whatever, and having a good old time. And they got together, and it was, the closest thing to normal that they could have gotten. They were all alone as the disabled kid out in the world. And when they came to Shriners, it was almost fun for us, for some of them.
And I'm glad there's a Shriner type of situation.
Yeah.
This was dorm 22.
Right. Different situation.
Yeah,
Different
I mean,
situation.
And I'm not trying to depress you. I'm trying to say that disabilities at that time were seen as a kind of a shameful failure, etc. Mark.
Well, I asked you, how did you deal with this? What transfigured or and how did you?
I came home and read John 9. Art asked me how I dealt with it.
Went to the seminary.
Yeah, but well, it did lead to the seminary, but that's another story. I went home and read John 9, and then I wrote a poem. And if you're interested, I'll bring the copies next week. Anyway, John 9 inspired a poem that I wrote that kind of asked the question, not whose fault is it, but why are there birth defects? Why are there children that are inflicted with terrible disabilities, of all kinds? I mean, from mental to physical to end up with cancer, when they're just children, that sort of thing. So it was a puzzle to me. I mean, it was and worse, it was a challenge to me because I had to get up every morning, show up at 7 in the morning and ready to work. And work we did, feeding, changing diapers, bathing them, and putting them on their seats for 8 hours straight. That's what I did. And I'll just say a quick note. Without those 2 years, I would have never gone to seminary. So it led sort of directly to seminary. Here's my point. And on the poem that I wrote, I asked the question, in a broken world where things are not always right. I mean, go back to the Genesis account. Whatever you make of Genesis as a myth or science or it's not, whatever it is. Here's what I think, what Genesis is trying to explain in Genesis 3. Why it is that women have pain in childbirth. Why is it that men work themselves to a nub in the fields with sweat of the brow? And why is it we have conflict with certain aspects of nature, like snakes and scorpions, all the rest? So Genesis 3 is trying to answer a question. Why is it we go through this stuff, right? And I don't need to take it literally or scientifically. I just need to take it as a statement of truth. We live in a broken world, and we live east of Eden. And we live in a world where children are born blind, and they have cancer, they have physical disabilities, they have mental disabilities, and they die young. I mean, this is kind of the world we live in. And in the first century world, child mortality rates were very high. It's one of the reasons they had so many children, etc. So I had to answer for myself, what kind of God does this? And so I followed what Jesus said in this text, which is, it's not the parents. It's not a little bad baby in the fetus, bad fetus baby. It's rather that works might be done and demonstrated in this man born blind, so that the man born blind becomes an object of God's power and God's grace to heal. And it's not just physical healing that happens to this man. He becomes a bold and almost sardonic witness to Jesus by the end of this chapter. So okay, if I can say it like this, I'll tell you what the poem basically says. If you get stuck on the why and how did this happen and the who's to blame and blah, 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 it'll paralyze you. I mean, the disciples weren't going to do anything for this guy, right? They just wanted a theological discussion about it. No. If you move beyond that to, okay, we have this world east of Eden that's broken in 1,000 different ways. What are we going to do about it? And so Jesus heals the man. So in my poem, I basically said, I'm going to lay aside for now answers to that question, who sinned, whatever that's supposed to be, or why did this happen? I'm going to focus on how can my hands be useful in a reclaiming of a broken world. Now, does that sound too simplistic? I mean, that's kind of what I had to, listen, I was getting up early morning for a year. I had to find some reason I was doing this at 7 in the morning at dorm 22 until 3, blessed 3, when it came. Anyway, just so let me stop and see if you have some thoughts about this. Maybe you struggled with someone who's been born, you know, with a disability, an illness, you know, some terrible dilemma. And maybe you've struggled with that question too. Yeah.
You know, Ellen Wiesel came to UNM several years ago and brought him to talk to our students. And after he was finished, somebody asked him a question that I'll never forget. They said, aren't you angry at everything that happened to you in the camp? And how can you continue to try to be there for others when nobody was there for you? And he said something that has stuck with me. He said, when I die, God and I are going to have a little talk. He said, but I can't burden myself with, you know, being angry. And I'm curious, is that something we can do? Put those things in the back pocket and say, you know, someday I'll you know, we'll figure it out.
Brina noted that when Elie Wiesel came to UNM, that he was asked why he wasn't more angry about what happened to the Jewish people during World War II. And he says, well, so his answer was what?
When I die, God and I are going to have a little talk.
When I die, God and I are going to have a little talk, you know. And yeah, I mean, I'd probably like to know, but here's what I think Jesus is saying. To get stuck in the whys or how this happened or God, this is unfair. You know, it's to move immediately to what can we do for this brother who can't see east of Eden, you know. And for me, that was the jump I had to make instead of being stuck in this why, how, whatever. George, you dealt with a lot of suffering. I mean, I don't know.
Well, this story reminds me of one of our trips to Guatemala, we visited a place like your fort that you were on. And they were saying that often, at least in this particular town, a child was born like that, and the family couldn't really handle it. They would just put it out on the street, you know. And so one of the jobs this place had was to go looking for throwaway kids, and they had a whole room of them. And I remember each of us had a chance to sit with one of these, and I, you know, looked into the face of this one, you know, person who couldn't talk or say anything, you know, just looking eye to eye, you know, it was very neat.
Well, Mother Teresa in Calcutta had one of her Sisters of Charities group do they were basically exposing children, you know, in India. It was very common. You had a disabled child, you would either throw them out in the garbage dump or on the streets. So anyways, Mother Teresa had a whole group of folks with that and people who were dying. Those were the two areas. So she dealt with children, infants, and the elderly, mainly, you said. Anyway, so for me, when we look at extreme suffering, especially children, that, you know, just right from the get-go, they have those disabilities. You can get stuck in the how and the why, or you can move like Jesus, I think, encourages us in John 9 to go, what can I do? And he puts mud on his eyes. You know, oh, and it's on the Sabbath, by the way. So now we got the question of, was this work or not? But, you know, okay. So I want y'all to know that John 9 helped me when I'm 22, like no other piece of scripture has ever helped me in a specific kind of situation. And I ended up studying a whole lot, the whole question of birth defects. They had some people at Abilene State School who actually would come around and sort of lecture about it and what was going on. And, you know, it's just, look, we live in a broken world where genetic things don't work all the time, right, John? I see my friend John Ferris out there, you know, and genetics are broken like the rest of the world. Genetics are east of Eden, like everything else, that we're looking for the redemption of the world when that which is broken will be healed. You know? So, well, to paraphrase the rest of this chapter, here's what happens. The Pharisees basically want to know, are you the guy that Jesus, and who is Jesus? And what's he doing working on the Sabbath? So things get all convoluted, and then the parents are brought in. And the parents now, is this your kid? And the parents are afraid now of, quote, being thrown out of the synagogue. Now, this is clearly reading back into the time of Jesus, what was happening to the church in the 90s. Because that's what was happening to the church in the 90s. If you confess that Jesus was the Christ, out you went from the synagogue. So now the parents are worried about getting thrown out of the synagogue. And then when the man born blind gets his sea legs, he starts defending himself and Jesus and becomes bitingly ironic to his accusers, saying, well, you want me to tell you again what happened? Well, do you want to become his disciples yourself? Oh, no. We're Moses' disciples. We wouldn't think of that, you know, that sort of thing. And then the man now who can see really gets accusatorial. He says, never before in the history of the world has someone come and healed a man born blind and given him sight. Well, now he's confessing he's a prophet. Well, after this, he's thrown out of the synagogue, just like his parents were afraid of, right? They're afraid of getting thrown out. He gets thrown out. He's been healed of blindness, and now he's thrown out of the synagogue, right? He's lost his community. And then Jesus finds him. And let's go to the scene at the end. This is in verse 35, 9:35. When Jesus heard what had happened, that is, the man was expelled from the synagogue, he found the man and asked him, do you believe in the Son of Man? It's kind of I'd say out of the blue kind of question. And the man answered, tell me who he is, sir, so that I can believe in him. And Jesus said, you have already seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you now. In the Gospel of John, you remember when he's talking to the Samaritan woman? He says, you're talking to him? Yeah, it's similar here. Okay. And then he says, I believe, Lord, the man said, and knelt before Jesus. And Jesus said, I came to this world to judge, so that the blind should see, and those who see should become blind. John 9 is the perfect model of what's supposed to happen when there's a miracle. The person who experiences it is not only to be fixed of their malady, but to end up confessing that Jesus is the Lord, the Son of Man. In other words, healing is not complete until there's confession. You are the one, that sort of thing. And then Jesus says, so I came for judgment. Several other places in the Gospel of John, it will say, I did not come to judge, or condemn the world. But John's gospel sort of oscillates on that question. Here, the issue is when I bring light to those who are in darkness and they see, the ones who are in darkness don't see. So here, once again, this controversy about a miracle. The one who was blind can see, and he confesses that Jesus is the Son of Man. The ones who think they can see, they're blinded by the light, and they can't see at all. That's how the story ends. That's how John 9 ends. So if you want to know how miracles go in the Gospels, this is kind of the way it should go, that is with a man born blind. But this is the way it often does go with the Pharisees who say, well, look, he did this on the Sabbath, so he couldn't possibly be, you know, a man of God. That sort of thing. Isn't that a great story? Is that like the finest gospel story in the whole book? Right. What do you think about this? What do y'all think about this in digital land? Well, John 9, you know, Paul says in Romans 15 that scripture was written for our encouragement. And I would say to y'all, I can't tell you how important John 9 has been in helping me deal with just what seemed to be terrible unfairness and people who end up with birth defects or car wrecks or just put in the whatever. Yeah.
Well, all of that stuff serves to give you, us normal people,
Yeah.
Reason to be thankful. I mean,
That's right.
It really gives you, you know, you're just glad you're where you are.
Yeah.
And I don't know, over here in Tim, there's a thing about it. It comes down to Jesus came to give abundant life.
Abundant life.
And that's really what you get.
Yeah.
And going back to Shriners, we had kids that were terrible kids.
Yeah.
We also had some really great ones.
Yeah.
We had a guy who couldn't move his hands. And
Mhm.
he insisted on brushing his own teeth and all of that stuff. He had pretty bad breath.
Yeah. Yeah.
Never mind.
Never mind.
He tried. He
Yeah.
did everything he could. And others, you know, so that's the divide. You know, there are those who do what they can, and those who you know, cave in,
Sure.
and that's the whole deal here in these two chapters.
So Nicole, you've had 2 children in recent years. Let me guess, when you had your child after you stopped screaming, was your first question the same question I asked when Sharon and I had our 2 boys, which was, is he healthy? Was that your first question?
Yes, and in that very context, there was a lot of fear behind that because he had a mass on his kidney. It turned out to be completely benign and actually went away on its own. But that was a huge fear for us, and he ended up spending the week in the NICU and just prayed and we were blessed in that. That's another testimony.
Absolutely.
He was completely healed of whatever little mass that was.
Thanks be to God. I got to tell y'all, in 46 years of the ministry, some of the memories I have, I just soon forget, but I can tell you at least 5 or 6 times I've gone to the hospital of church members who either the baby died, you know, in childbirth or something like that, or the baby had real serious handicaps. And those are some of the hardest hospital visits I think I've ever done, you know, because I realized, wow, this is going to be a huge challenge, and it changes people's lives. I mean, babies change people's lives, period, right? But when you have the added responsibility of caring for someone, you know, and it's interesting, the parents here kind of throw him under the bus, you know, well, you ask him, you know, because they're afraid, you know, And you wonder about the relationship between these parents and this man born blind, but the story doesn't give us any information. Well, I just thank you for letting me share that, because John 9 is immensely important to me to this day. That if we get stuck in how and why, and don't move to what can we do, then we've got a real problem. We're stuck. We're stuck.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why is, how do we deal with the Haitians, the Chinese persecution of their sectors, all the atrocities that we see against groups of people? How does that fit into all this passage?
So you're talking about like people hurting people on purpose.
Yes.
Yeah. So the question is, what happens when there's suffering inflicted from person to person? And yeah, I mean, it's kind of I kind of have to say to myself, if I were in an aid business of, dealing with the refugees fleeing from like the Uyghur people from the Chinese, if they were coming over into Mongolia or something, I probably wouldn't spend much time asking why or how the Chinese do this, but I'd be asking myself, what can we do to help these people right now? And my answer theologically, and it may not be adequate, but is this: we live east of Eden. We live in a broken world. I'm not going to exactly ever know how or why that's the case, but at least what I know from Genesis 3 is nature itself is not what it was. It's not perfect. I mean, I'll put it like this: nature is not perfect because Eve's first childbirth was not good. It was not easy, right? From the get-go, right? Humans have had to labor and struggle, for their food from the get-go. And we have conflicts with nature. That snake is a larger issue to me than just a talking reptile. It's rather nature that has gone awry. For instance, viruses. George.
Goat heads. Adam, he had to go out and God said we're gonna make vines with thorns all over.
Yeah.
And every time I get one in my toe, I think he did it,
Adam. Yeah. So you found somebody to blame. Very good. Thank you, George. Okay. Well, the way the Adam story is told in the Bible, it's more like, hey, I represent that guy. I know this guy. That's moi. Yeah. Eve, that's you. Eve, Adam, we have met the enemy, and it's us. Right? So I don't ever project blame on some mythical figure in the past. I keep saying, that's who I am. That's what I do. By the way, with my students, when we study Romans 7, where it says, the good that I would do, I don't, and the evil that I want to avoid, I do, and then the law sort of incites me to riot. The law says, you shall not trespass. Let's jump that fence. And I always say that the clear proof of that is APD has checked the average speed in the Big I. You know what the average speed in the Big I is?
72.
72.
I'm pretty good. I always go 71.
Yeah, Bruce, thank you. Yeah. And I always say, what's the speed limit in the Big I?
65.
Case closed. My case is closed. But my point is that that's me. That's who I am. You can have every tree in the garden, just not that one. Why not? Why not? Okay. We hate to be restricted in any way, shape, or form. I really think it's at the heart of the mass debate. There's a little Adam and Eve in every one of us that says, watch me. Watch that. Yeah. Anyway, so John 9 says we live in a broken world. Things happen to children who are victims, and we don't quite know who to blame or why, or how even sometimes. Now, science is helping us more and more on how, right? We're getting closer on a lot of those things. But you know what? The question is, okay, so what am I gonna do about it? I've got this room full of kids, 30 kids, one guy, my coworker is the wrong word to use. Supervisor who sat on his butt. Anyway, that's a different way I would describe him. He'd been in that job for about 30 years. Okay, John 10. Jesus continues this discussion, and it ends up making a statement that is astonishing. I am the good shepherd. I am the gate for the sheep to come in and out. The sheep know my voice, and I know them, and they know me. So that is not just a beautiful Sunday school picture. It's Ezekiel 34, that the true king of Israel is a good shepherd. Like, remember good old David, right? So it's a throwback to the David era. And then what happens in verse 22, 10:22, we switch to a different festival. It was winter, and the festival of the dedication of the temple was being celebrated in Jerusalem. Y'all know what that festival is? It's not in the Bible. It's in First Maccabees. It's Hanukkah. Hanukkah. And Hanukkah happens about the same time as Christmas, December usually, right? And it celebrates when the Maccabeans overthrew the Syrians, started a war against them in 167, and in 164, they won the war, threw the Syrians out, and they rededicated the temple. And the lore of that rededication was they had a menorah with 7 candles, and oil kept supplying them miraculously 7 days of light. So when the Jewish people come together at Hanukkah, to this day, it's 7 days of lighting a candle, etc. So, but the Hanukkah is not in the Hebrew Bible. It's in First Maccabees. Okay, that happened 167 years before Jesus, 164. So he's in the temple. They're celebrating Hanukkah, and he's walking in the temple, and they start pressing Jesus. How and why are you doing all this stuff? And let me cut to the chase when Jesus says something that really, really gets them excited. Look at verse 37, 10:37. He says this, do not believe me then if I am not doing the things my Father wants me to do. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, you should at least believe my deeds. So he points to the miracles, right? In order that you may know once and for all that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Once more, they tried to seize Jesus, but he slipped out of their control. So in some of your Bibles, does it say, where's the phrase before Abraham was I am? Let's see. Look up in 29. What my Father has given me is greater than everything, and no one can snatch them away from me, from the Father's care. The Father and I are one. And here we go, stones again. So, you know, they're ever ready to start throwing stones at him, right? And he, quote, slips out of their way. So this chapter ends up saying things like, I am the good shepherd, I am the gate, I came to bring life and have it more abundantly. I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am. Look, if you don't believe in me, believe in the works. And they do what? They want to pick up stones. So in the Gospel of John, the words of Jesus interpret his deeds. And they're supposed to go together, right? And see that as one picture. All right. Well, John 9 and 10 are great, and they show this conflictual Jesus, and I'll go back to my contention about the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John was written for a church that needed a very assertive Jesus, a Jesus who would assert who he was, and people would be bold to testify to him. So John 9 has the perfect disciple who goes from being a beggar, who's blind, who's never seen a day in his life, who can see, and he starts defending himself. I'm the guy. And then he starts defending Jesus. And when Jesus finds him, he ends up bowing before him and confessing him as the Son of Man. And that's the perfect disciple. So if you're asking what the church is to learn from John 9, don't get stuck in the how or the why. Get stuck with the what can we do, and then see what happens to people when they've been transformed. And they go from being tentative to being what? Absolutely bulldogs, you know, who worship Christ. So that's John 9 and 10. Thoughts, questions, comments? The artistry in this stuff is just great. I mean, I got to say, it's just tremendous. I love reading the Gospel of John, trying to figure out how he's putting the pieces together.
You know, I get that you got to get on with it. And like Elie Wiesel, he said, they didn't come for us, so we will be there for others. And he would go to Eastern Europe and stuff like that.
That's right.
But isn't it okay to think that at some point you'll get it? I mean, you'll understand. You can still keep going out and doing what needs to be done. But I don't understand like the stuff in Syria,
Right.
all those kids.
Yeah. Oh, it's awful.
And you know,
That's also in here, that there's those who believe and those who doubt, right? There's the two factions that are always there. I mean,
From the get-go.
with the mask, with, you know, with the immigration thing, with everything, you know, it's, there's people who think we should do it the right way and the wrong way. Actually, I think, the people on the wrong side, if you're on one side, are trying to do what they think is the right thing too, you know, that's, I was gonna say something about art and the leaders, that the Chinese government has always re-educated people. They're not putting them all to death, you know, they think that what they need to do is control these people, right? That's their belief. They think we've got to get these people in line so that they're productive and whatever. And, you know, the stories you hear, I don't know, they're pretty bad. But,
Yeah, they are.
and who knows how true all the stories are from one side or the other, right? I mean, it's all questionable. So,
Rita, one thing I'd say is that I think that since I worked on Dorm 22, there's been a lot of advances in the study of birth defects, so that the how question, you know, why things happen, and why you have babies that are born blind, et cetera, you know what I mean? So I think we do care about how, you know what I mean? And so you do research and you try your best to have healthy babies, you know what I mean? And the child mortality rate has dropped a lot, you know, in the last 100 years or so. So I'm not suggesting that we stop asking the questions, you know what I mean? And I think theologically, I depend on Paul in lots of different ways, but when he says, now we see in a glass darkly and then face to face in 1 Corinthians 13, I think there's a sense in which things will become revealed to us that we don't know the answer to now. I mean, the disciples must have thought they were asking a legitimate theological question, right? Who sinned? The parents or this guy? The assumption might have been this guy was being punished even for future sins. I mean, you know what I mean? So they're interested in this theological discussion. And Jesus says, well, some theological discussions, we can't get all the answers right now. We see it in last dark. But here's another question. What are we going to do about this guy? That too is a question.
And the what might be investigate the how and why. But what might be
The,
that?
the what may help you understand
Yeah.
why, yeah. I've known some parents who had a disabled child and later, many years later, could look back on it and say, as painful as it was, it made us better people. You know, now for others, it'll break them, but you know, but for some, it can make them better people.
Yes, I was a APS school nurse, and my first stint was with the severely handicapped pod in South Valley. And their plan for education was see if we can teach them to roll over.
Yeah.
You know, but the whole complex had to be treated, the whole family system had to be
Yes.
treated.
Yes.
And I think APS has done such a good job of trying to incorporate the, you know, all of that as opposed to just changing diapers.
Yeah, the whole person.
But doesn't it make you wonder if that would have happened if the lawsuits weren't brought? I mean, they were forced to do that.
That's right. Yeah.
And I'm sure
Oh,
those
yeah.
homes that you were in,
Oh.
they're shut down.
Oh, it totally changed.
Right.
Yeah, right. They don't warehouse them anywhere like what I was experiencing. Pardon? Yeah, well, unfortunately. But by the way, when I moved to Abilene, just a quick note, I went from the lowest level of folks, you know, the disability change to the highest. So now I had young men who were testing out of the 60s, who if they tested 70, they'd have gone to the state reform school. They were juvenile delinquents. So here then it shifted in Abilene to the question of physical violence done to others. My job at Austin State School, we'll end with this, was totally different than Abilene. My job for 1 year at Austin State School was to keep Gathan Mathis from killing the rest of the kids. I remember two names, Gathan Mathis, who was a sociopath, and Willie Bonton, who happened to be my bodyguard. And Willie Bonton saved me twice from Gathan Mathis. Gathan Mathis would have killed me twice, but Willie Bonton saved me. So, you know, the first year was just physical disabilities. The second year was crime and violence. You think I limped out of there to seminary? Yeah, I did. But by the grace of God, I ended up in seminary after those 2 years of looking at the brokenness of human life in any way you shape or form. All right, well, thank you for letting me tell you that story. And let's have a prayer before we go. Loving and gracious God, give us hearts that care deeply about others in their plight and their need, and grant us hands to work in retooling and reshaping your world. For the sake of Christ Jesus, our Lord, we pray. Amen. Bye, y'all. Bye, digital land. We'll look at John 11 next week.